time to run down the weekend in the ACC with Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC, as we, of course, have one obvious headliner in this batch of games, as unfortunately the Florida school still unable to play, and Georgia Tech also affected. Mike, how you doing today?
Doing well, Mark. How are you doing?
Doing great. So I'm looking forward to this primetime matchup. Louisville-Clemson, they had a barn burner at Clemson last year where Lamar Jackson led a late drive, got within 10 to 15 yards of pulling off the upset. And, of course, Clemson needed that game with the loss to Pitt to make it to the ACC championship game and on to win the whole thing. And then the slide came for Louisville down the stretch. So here we are 1 year later, and they match up at Louisville.
Yeah, so this is a tough game to handicap, I guess, from a betting perspective, right? Because Clemson enters as a 3-point road favorite. Now, Papa John's is a very tough place to go and play. Ask Florida State. They went in there at noon last year in mid-September and got their hats handed to them. It's interesting because Clemson's front seven against Louisville's offensive line is really the only matchup we care about in this game, in my opinion. Because you look at Louisville's offensive line, and they were struggling so mightily towards the back half of last season, a reason why they slid down the stretch and lost the final 3 games. And some of their games there late in the season were a little bit shaky to begin with. You'll remember that game against Wake Forest where, it was going back and forth. That was in November before the slide. They were going back and forth and couldn't really put Wake Forest away until a strong flurry of scoring in the fourth quarter. That was kind of the beginning of the drop-off for the offensive line for Louisville. And, their fans are suggesting, because through 2 performances this year against North Carolina and in the opener against Purdue, they haven't given up as many sacks on the offensive line. But you take a step back and you realize that those 2 defenses are really nothing to write home about. Not great defenses that they've faced so far, and definitely not even close to the level of defense they'll be facing on Saturday night against Clemson. Clemson's front seven is one of the best in the country, at least top 3 or 4. In the entire nation, and one of the best in the ACC, right up there with Florida State. And what's scary about Clemson is that their defensive line this year might be even better than it was last year. And the defensive line last year was a strong reason why they ended up winning the national championship, because they were able to get pressure on the quarterback and they were able to stop the run. And that's what I worry about with Louisville in this game, even though they're at home. And I'm thinking about how the Cardinals nearly knocked off Clemson in Death Valley last October. You take a step back and think about it and you say, man, Louisville did lose a lot of talent on offense and defense, though. This is not the same team. And I'm not really sure the offensive line has gotten all that much better. And because of that, I love Clemson in this game. I don't think they're going to score a ton of points. I really don't. We still don't know 100% what we have in Kelly Bryant yet. I mean, they're still trying to get their feet under them there with the Clemson offense. Kelly Bryant clearly is good. He's the right guy to play quarterback, at least this year for the Tigers. He's been poised. He was really strong against Auburn last weekend. Auburn's got a great defense, obviously, and they were able to put a lot of pressure on Clemson, but Clemson responded and were able to punch him right back in the mouth, which I think is very encouraging if you're a Clemson fan looking out towards the rest of the season. So I think Clemson will score enough points here against Louisville to end up getting the job done. But the reason why I'm picking the Tigers in this one over the Cardinals is purely because of the defense. As good as Lamar Jackson is, if he doesn't have time to throw, it's going to be a really, really rough evening for Louisville. Our buddy Joey Weaver, who I have my podcast with every week on the ACC, he put it this way: this is going to be one of the worst games that Louisville plays all year, and he really believes that. Now, I'm not sure if that's entirely going to be the case. Louisville still has a bunch of tough games remaining on their schedule, but my belief is shared with him in that I don't believe Louisville will be able to block Clemson up front. I think that's what's going to end up being the difference in this game. So I like Clemson to go on the road and win here.
I have yet to make a prediction on this game, but release my picks each and every week, so they'll be coming up soon. So don't hold me to this one, but I really like Clemson in this game. I know that it's a difficult environment at Papa John's Stadium. You also have, of course, the Lamar Jackson factor, possibly the best player in the country, the most athletic offensive player in the country. I don't think there's a question about that. And I just believe in Clemson defensively. I believe in their ability to play in hostile environments. I don't think that phases them at this point. I know a lot of these guys are not the guys that won championships in the previous 2 seasons, but still the core of this team is intact. They've been in the culture. They've been under Dabo Swinney, and I just think that they're the better team. I still think a gap exists in the ACC between Clemson, Florida State, and everybody else, and maybe Miami's got a chance to catch up with the other 2. We shall see, but I don't think Louisville is quite there, and I really believe in Clemson's defense in particular. Auburn has some issues on offense, but Auburn will score points against decent defenses in the SEC. Jarrett Stidham's a good quarterback. Now, Lamar Jackson's a completely different animal in terms of mobility, but to hold Auburn to just over 100 yards of total offense and 6 points is pretty ridiculous. So Clemson-Louisville highlights the weekend, certainly the first big matchup we've had in the ACC this season. Louisville, lackluster performance against Purdue, escaped with a win, turned the ball over all over the place, but Lamar still had like 500-plus yards of offense. We really saw Louisville kick it into gear against an outmanned North Carolina team that was hanging in the game for most of it through about 3 quarters before the Cardinals put it on overdrive. All right, we've got Oklahoma State taking on Pitt. These two teams waged war in Stillwater last year, and the Panthers came away with a 7-point loss. Of course, they traveled to Penn State last week, and Pitt suddenly has one of the tougher schedules in college football, and in scheduling 2 of the tougher Power 5 teams, 2 legitimate top 10 teams, and really weren't in the game against Penn State and their dynamic playmakers on offense, and they'll see more of the same at Heinz Field with Oklahoma State.
Yeah, the problem here for Pittsburgh, and Mark, I like to bet on some of these college football games. The thing that strikes me about this one, with Oklahoma State entering as an 11.5-point road favorite, at least the last I saw, the thing that strikes me about this is that Pittsburgh's going to try to sit on the football like they did last weekend against Penn State. It worked. It kept them in the game score-wise. Pittsburgh was never really in that game last weekend, but they gave off the vibe and the illusion that they were if you just looked at the score. The problem with Pittsburgh in this game is they're going to have to do the same sort of thing against Oklahoma State, and Oklahoma State scores a lot more quickly than Penn State does, and they can put up tons of yards through the air. Mason Rudolph slings it all over the field, and the weakness in Pittsburgh's secondary, or on Pittsburgh's defense, is the secondary, and that's really what this boils down to. Pittsburgh's had all those suspensions on defense, plus the loss of talent to the NFL last year. You lose Ewan Price, and you can go down the list of guys in their secondary that they lost as well. But Pittsburgh's defense is not strong at all. In Oklahoma State, their strength is throwing the football against a really bad Pittsburgh secondary. I love Oklahoma State in this road matchup to win pretty handily. I think Pittsburgh will try to hang around as best as they can in this one, try to run the football and keep Oklahoma State's offense off the field. But given how quickly Oklahoma State can score, I like the Cowboys to win and to cover in this one.
Heinz Field, not exactly a huge home field advantage for the Panthers as well. Oklahoma State, again, has yet to play anybody of value. Tulsa and South Alabama are the 2 wins to date, but they've shown us in the last few years, and Mason Rudolph and company, James Washington, and wide receiver, they've already played in and won big games, won a bowl game against Colorado. One of the more explosive offenses in college football. And as you mentioned, Mike, the matchup just isn't there when you look at Pitt's secondary, which gave up over 300 passing yards to Youngstown State, escaping in overtime to beat the Penguins. Very difficult task for the Panthers. I don't know about the 11.5 points. I will need to think about that one for a while.
Fair.
Notre Dame and BC. So the Irish really had, for most of the game, a 1-score lead over Georgia last weekend. Brandon Wimbush has looked good through 2 games. They really took it to Temple on the ground, especially the week before, with 422 rushing yards. Now face up against the BC club, and this game being played, let's see, in Boston. So your thoughts about the Eagles and the Irish getting together?
This is another one of those games where you look at it from an outsider's perspective and you're thinking, well, Boston College has upset Notre Dame before, so this is another year where they can do it, because Notre Dame just lost at home to Georgia last weekend. Georgia's a pretty good football team. They have a really good defense, and Notre Dame struggled to really put that game away, which is why they ended up losing in South Bend last weekend. But the one thing about Notre Dame is that their defense has really improved, at least based off of their opening 2 performances against both Temple and Georgia. They at least look better than they did a year ago when they went 4-8. A lot of people are obviously citing Brian Kelly's record here, the last year and a half in 1-score games, and that's completely fair and warranted at this point in time, just given that they can't really close out good teams when they get within 1 score and it's a close game late. but a lot of that was due last year, especially to really poor defensive performance that they were putting out there. Defense has been much better. Boston College's offense is horrible. I do think Notre Dame will score enough points, even though that offense is still a work in progress here. With Brendan Winbush at the quarterback position. I like Notre Dame to win this one comfortably up there at Chestnut Hill. I just think Notre Dame's defense, with Mike Elko as a first-year defensive coordinator, is taking a lot of positive strides. I think that will continue to be the case this weekend against a Boston College team that couldn't even move the ball on Wake Forest. And if you can't move the ball on Wake Forest, you're not going to move it on Wake Forest former defensive coordinator Mike Elko, who's now at Notre Dame. So I like the Irish to win this one pretty comfortably up there in Chestnut Hill.
Mike McDaniel from Inside the ACC joining us to break down this weekend in the ACC, headlined by Clemson-Louisville. Please check out that specific video. One of the more underrated and undervalued performances of week 2, in my opinion, was a game that I locked in on for a time that I thought was going to be a very competitive, interesting game between the Big Ten and the ACC, Northwestern at Duke. I was not shocked that the Blue Devils won the game, but that they completely tore Northwestern to shreds. Daniel Jones was extremely impressive in that game, and the Duke defense was stifling against what we had anticipated to be a pretty formidable opponent in Northwestern.
Yeah, that Duke game was surprising. Again, not because they won, but the manner in which they won. I think people are going to come out of that game last week and overrating Duke a little bit because Northwestern did look so bad, especially offensively. But you look at Duke, I mean, they play an FCS opponent in week 1, and then last weekend they roll Northwestern, obviously off to a 2-0 start, and Daniel Jones is one of the best quarterbacks in the conference, no question about that. The thing to watch in this game is Baylor comes in extremely desperate, and while they've looked horrible, they lost to Liberty, they lost to UTSA, they have not looked good at all. Baylor really, really needs this game. I'm not confident enough to pick Baylor to win just because of the state of their football program at present. But Duke being a 2-touchdown favorite at home, that seems like a lot of points to me against a Baylor team that still has plenty of athletes on that field, a team that's really desperate. So I think the spread here, it's a little bit of a trap game. I can see how Duke can run away with this thing and win by a bunch. But I also think that Baylor's extremely desperate. Matt Rule is a really good coach. He needs to get this thing rolling in the right direction, and really nothing has gone their way through the first 2 weeks of the season. I think Baylor's due. I think Baylor will keep it close. I think Duke will win just because the one known commodity in this game is Daniel Jones. He's been spectacular, and they're playing at home. So I'll pick Duke to win, but don't be surprised if Baylor makes this thing a little bit closer than a lot of people expect.
Yeah, new coaches in the Big 12 having issues looking at Tom Herman, and then especially Matt Rule, and facing two Group of 5 and FCS opponents the first 2 weeks. It's amazing that Baylor is 0-2 at this standpoint, and really an embarrassment at this point heading out to Duke. But I'm with you in regards to that point spread possibly being a little heavy at this point. All right, Mike McDaniel from Inside the ACC talking up the conference as we look toward week 3. We've got East Carolina traveling to Virginia Tech. The Hokies with a big win in week 1 against West Virginia, holding on that final possession of defense to pull out a narrow win, 31-24. Your thoughts about the Hokies thus far as they match up against the Pirates?
They haven't been able to run the ball. I think that's the biggest issue with Virginia Tech, and they really haven't run the ball well in the first year and a half now that Justin Fuente's been in Blacksburg. Obviously, when you break in a new quarterback, it would be nice if you had a running game to complement his skill set. Right now, the Hokies don't have that. I think that's what's problematic about their offensive attack so far. And what you saw against Delaware last weekend was Josh Jackson didn't throw the ball great. He didn't have his best game throwing the football. Didn't look quite as polished as he did against West Virginia. Some of that might be due to it being a short week and the fact the Hokies didn't practice in pads all of last week due to the physical nature of that game against West Virginia. But some of it, too, is kind of the fact that you're coming home and you're playing Delaware. It's pretty tough to get up for a game against Delaware just days after beating a team like West Virginia at FedEx Field in a neutral site. But the Hokies need to play better offensively specifically. They need to run the football better. I think Jackson will come around and he'll be fine. He's been good so far because he hasn't turned the football over. I think that's the one really positive thing you can say about his performance so far is that he's taking care of the football. Defensively, the Hokies have been fantastic. I expect it to remain the case against East Carolina and Scotty Montgomery. A lot of people are saying, okay, well, East Carolina is one of those teams that has upset Virginia Tech before, but this is not the same East Carolina team that's played against Virginia Tech in the past when Ruffin McNeil was their coach. When Ruffin McNeil was the coach at East Carolina, you'll remember the Hokies went into Columbus in 2014. They beat the Buckeyes, came home the following week and got upset by East Carolina. And I know Mark, as an Ohio State fan, you'll remember that happening. You're like, wow, who did we just lose to the week before? But this is not the same East Carolina team, and Scotty Montgomery has not had the same success in his first few years against Virginia Tech that Ruffin McNeil had. I think the Hokies should win this game pretty comfortably. I like their defense here. Their matchup against East Carolina's offense, which hasn't been that good so far. Former ACC quarterback Thomas Sirk, who used to be a member of the Duke Blue Devils, is the quarterback for East Carolina, but he's questionable, dealing with a concussion. So all the better for the Hokies if they're playing against a backup quarterback in this game specifically.
We've got Mike McDaniel on the line from inside the ACC. Please join him there for the best in ACC football coverage. As we round out week 3, we've got a number of matchups that the ACC should sweep. Central Michigan at Syracuse, not necessarily a gimme for the Orange at home. North Carolina hosting Old Dominion. You've got Virginia, UConn. This is a game that the Cavaliers blew with a missed field goal with about 4 minutes left at Connecticut. Last year, they get the return trip. NC State hosting Furman as well. So the one note that I'll make is that I did catch some of the Indiana-Virginia game last week, a 34-17 loss for the Cavaliers. It's a defense that's really not that bad. So it's a decent defense, but it's coupled with an offense that is so limited, could not get any push up front, did the Cavaliers against Indiana, a front that's pretty good out of the Big Ten. But Kurt Benkert, not an awful quarterback, but had to check down considerably. Receivers not getting any type of room or space in the opposing secondary. Benkert kind of a limited quarterback, not dynamic with his feet. I think Virginia's looking at the typical maybe 4-8 finish right here. So anything out of these additional games, and not necessarily these matchups, but the rest of these teams that stand out to you?
I mean, Virginia has looked better and more competitive through 2 weeks. I think that's one takeaway from them so far. UConn is really, really bad. Virginia is a 2-touchdown favorite, 10.5-point favorite, I think, at this point at home, which is, I don't know. It seems like a lot of points, but it also seems like a spot that Virginia can go ahead and win there against UConn. I mean, UConn has not looked great. They are 1-0, but it was an ugly 1-0 there at the start of the season. Virginia's looked very good on defense. They put up a performance against Indiana that I thought was pretty solid, all things considered. I mean, Indiana's a pretty good football team in the Big Ten, at least defensively, and Virginia held their own for the most part, which I think is positive, especially when you look at Indiana the prior week, putting up a fight against Ohio State for about 2.5 quarters. So there are some positive. There's a little bit of positive momentum happening there in Charlottesville, but it'll be interesting to see if Virginia can carry that forward and win a game that they should this weekend against Connecticut. NC State, they got to blow out Furman. I mean, NC State has looked really underwhelming through 2 weeks. They gave the game away in week 1 against South Carolina. They didn't look great last weekend against Marshall, but ended up winning by 17, pulling away late. NC State needs to get off to a fast start against Furman. Furman cannot get in the end zone more than 2 or 3 times. If they score 21 points against NC State, we're really going to start to question that defense that was supposed to be one of the stronger parts of their team this year. Looking down the rest of the schedule, Wake Forest and Utah State, kind of an interesting matchup there. Utah State gave Wisconsin a run in week 1 for another team that really hung around there for a while before Wisconsin pulled away late. I think Utah State can give Wake Forest some problems early, but I think Wake Forest is a better football team. They've looked really, really solid so far. Offensively and defensively. John Wolford's been a pleasant surprise on the offensive side of the ball at the quarterback position. So if he can continue doing that both with his feet and with his arm, I think Wake Forest should win there and move to 3-0. North Carolina, Old Dominion. The Tar Heels really need this one, or the sky's going to be falling in Chapel Hill. They're looking to avoid an 0-3 start, the first 0-3 start under Larry Fedora. You know, Old Dominion is no slouch. I mean, that's a team that was really solid in the FCS, and then they became an FBS team 2 or 3 years ago now, and they've been building that program up. North Carolina needs to be really, really careful here. They're actually on the road at Old Dominion, which makes it an even more interesting matchup. But I do like North Carolina to get their first win there, but I would not be surprised if it was a little bit closer than a lot of people expect. And finally, Syracuse, like, nobody really knows what to make of the Orange so far. They looked impressive in week 1. in an FCS matchup. And then, of course, Syracuse loses last weekend to Middle Tennessee State, a game in which Eric Dungey didn't throw a touchdown pass. The fact that Eric Dungey, who throws the ball 50, 60 times a game, didn't throw a touchdown pass is probably a bigger upset than the actual game in which they lost to Middle Tennessee State. I expect Dungey to bounce back and beat Central Michigan, but Central Michigan has a pretty solid program there, so expect that game to be close too. So while there are not a lot of headline games in the ACC this weekend, I think there are a lot of games that could be a lot closer than a lot of people expect them to be.
To your point, Mike, I just assumed North Carolina was at home against Old Dominion. They are actually traveling to ODU and maybe showing the absence of talent from the 2016 squad in the state of North Carolina football this season. Only a 10-point favorite against Old Dominion, so that's not a lock, as is the Syracuse spread against Central Michigan, just about 10 points at home. So North Carolina actually played a nice game against Louisville for much of the game in Chapel Hill last week and had a chance to win. Surratt at quarterback, I thought, looked really good in relief of actually got the start because Brandon Harris was pretty awful against Cal. Surratt seems to be the guy. He looked good, the football that I saw against the Cardinals, but he's probable as he got nicked up last week against Louisville. Mike McDaniel, Inside the ACC. Please join him there for the very best in ACC football coverage. And, of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want to listen to the entire podcast with bloggers and broadcasters that are the very best in college football, including Mike, we make that available for you on Podbean, iTunes, and Stitcher. Just search Mark Rogers TV. All right, Mike, appreciate the rundown.
Thanks, Mark.